To you. Now I want to bring in president and co-founder of West Coast Trial Lawyers and former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani to discuss the details of the indictment and what could be next for the former president. Mr. Rahmani, thank you for being back with us. Let's get an initial reading of the charges and the counts for former President Trump. What do we make of what's laid out before us?
Well, Christian, really a fascinating indictment. And when special counsel Jack Smith asked the American public to read it, you know that this indictment was drafted as much for the case, but as far as we're concerned, it read like something that you don't typically see. We saw pictures in the indictment. We really saw the scheme laid out where the National Archives asked Trump for the documents for over a year. Then they made the referral to the Department of Justice, who, of course, first proceeded through a grand jury subpoena, then ultimately had to execute that search warrant. And then the indictment also lays out the dangers that these docs pose for the safety and security of the American public. Now, if you're looking at the charges themselves, they fall into two broad categories: the substantive counts with respect to the Espionage Act for retaining the documents, but also those obstruction of justice, false statement, and conspiracy counts. I think had the president not acted the way he did and just turned over the documents, we wouldn't be where we are here today.
Yeah, and I want to point out to our viewers that QR code you see in the bottom right-hand corner, that'll lead you directly to the indictment, which, as you said, has pictures. There are several allegations laid out throughout the pages. We also learned that Trump isn't alone here in this indictment. Who is this aide, Walt Nauta, and how serious are the charges against him?
Very serious. He's caught up in those obstruction charges. Now, this is Trump's valet, and they have a 20-year statutory max. Here's someone who is caught on surveillance video, and there's text messages showing that he's moving the documents from the storage room in Mar-a-Lago to Trump's residence before the raid and before the attorneys show up to look for the documents in response to the grand jury's also false statement allegations in an indictment. If you read through it, there's very clear statements where Nauta is saying, you know, I've never seen these documents. I don't know where they are. I don't know where they came from. But that apparently contradicts the evidence in this case, his own text messages and that video.
Yeah. One of the arguments we've heard from people right of center and some Trump advocates is that other people had documents. Pence had them. Biden had them in the garage with his Corvette. The DOJ is being weaponized against the former president and the GOP frontrunner for 2024. What's the difference here between Trump's case and others like it?
Well, that's something we're seeing a lot, Christian, on traditional and social media. And I mean, here's my response. It's not really a legal defense, right? If you're pulled over for speeding, you can't say, well, these other folks are speeding too. But practically speaking, you know, Mike Pence, Joe Biden, I think you can at least argue that their violations, if any, were negligent, and they did cooperate in getting these documents back to the National Archives where they belong. I think in Trump's case, you're going to have a very different argument. I think the DOJ will be able to prove in court obstructed. You know, they tried to take the easy path, the administrative path, right? Then the referral was made. They tried to proceed through this grand jury process. And even then, after the search warrant was executed, there were still more than 100 documents that Trump and his lawyers hadn't turned over. They provided a false certification to the grand jury. So I think the reason we ended up here and Pence and Biden have not is because of how Trump handled these documents. If he were more compliant, less obstructive, we probably wouldn't be seeing criminal charges here.
Yeah. It's not just that Trump had these documents, it's that he showed them to other people as laid out in the indictment, and at one point was even recorded saying that he could have declassified some of the documents but didn't. How might this play into the prosecution's case?
Well, I know Trump says that he could have declassified the documents, and maybe he could have had he gone through the proper process. But there's no evidence that that's happened in this case. You got to notify the department, and it can't hurt national security. So I don't think either of those two elements are. The problem with Trump's argument is this. If this legal is admitting knowledge that the documents were classified and his intent to keep them. So this is something that is probably his lawyers don't want to hear. They don't want him to say either publicly on social media, because you're really admitting elements of the crime here, that knowledge, that intent, if that legal argument fails.
Yeah, mens rea, right? I've talked to quite a few lawyers over the last few days. That's what you're talking about here. The intention behind what it is that he might have done.
Of course, that guilty mind, right? That's what mens rea is. And normally in these criminal cases, you don't have defendants that are admitting that, hey, I'm committing a crime. I knew there were drugs in my car. But in this case, you have those admissions from Trump, both in terms of the recording and him actively posting on social media. It's not helping his case. Now, I understand that politically this may make sense, but his lawyers must be cringing right now because it's making the legal case a lot harder to defend when their client is making all sorts of admissions.
Yeah. Neama, there's one more thing I wanted to get from you, and this is something I've heard over the last few days. It's very different when you're facing federal charges. Can you explain why that's so significant, especially when it comes to conviction rate, federal charges versus state charges? What is it that Trump's defense is up against here?
Oh, this case is much more serious than the New York case. I mean, we'll start with New York. There's a real possibility that a lot of those charges are reduced from felonies to misdemeanors, because under New York law, if the fraud isn't in furtherance or to cover up another crime, it's just a misdemeanor. So now, obviously, we all know that federal cases are more serious. Rarely do federal defendants, when they're convicted, get anything short of significant prison sentences. There aren't even a whole lot of misdemeanors under federal law. Usually they're felonies. So federal prosecutors, obviously I'm a little bit biased as a former DOJ official, they tend to be better. They have better resources. They have the FBI working with them as opposed to local law enforcement, and the conviction rates are high. And the judges, even though this is a Trump-appointed judge that we're dealing with, tend to impose longer sentences in federal court than state court. So this is all very bad news for the former president.
I appreciate you laying out that bias for our audience so they understand where it is that you're coming from, and I appreciate your expertise as well. President and co-founder of West Coast Trial Lawyers and former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani, many thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Christian, for having me, as always.